All right, we are just about to begin. I think I have all the technical things worked out, and we should be set to go. Okay, this is a very technical night tonight, and it's going to be extremely short. It could be as short as 45 minutes. And the reason for that is because in order to be longer, I would have to go to a new subject, and there wasn't a short subject that I could put in to make it a reasonable talk. All right. We are talking about methods of forecasting and predicting. Now, in the meeting previous to this, a month ago, we discussed some of the inadequacies of astrology. And in that, we noticed that forecasting and prediction were especially weak areas in astrology, where even the experts are, they're at a loss frequently. And we also noted that part of the deficiency is due to the fact that the future isn't all set. It isn't all written, or it isn't etched in stone. Now, this is important because it means that some things can be changed, and that when we see a difficult situation, it doesn't mean that there's going to be a disaster. It doesn't mean that there's going to be some kind of very painful event. It just means that there is a season for that. And if we don't have the right destiny for that, it isn't going to happen. And we are the ones that ripen our destiny by what we do and by what we don't do. So, we don't live in a fatalistic world. That's what this means. And it also means that astrology not only shows us troubled times, it shows us what we can do to change things. It likely shows us the purpose. So, astrology can indicate the likelihood of determinacy, but it all depends on free will. Does this mean that eventually, when we have extremely strong free will, that we will have no more trying circumstances, or that astrology will become meaningless? No. It doesn't mean that at all. It means that we will voluntarily work with the forces that are ripe in the cosmos and do creating relative to what's happening in the cosmos. So it is, astrology then begins to point at something else. What concerns us in this talk is the attempts to expand astrology and to do some things with it that we cannot do now. Like the existing astrology does have weaknesses. And so we're going to talk about different things. For this and the next few talks, we're going to be talking about opportunities or methods to expand astrology. Now, when we talk about this, a thing that comes up that is the proficiency of the astrologer. Maybe astrology isn't working in a time when we would forecast an event or a period of life, maybe that's so because the astrologer doesn't know how to do that, isn't proficient in understanding destiny. When things do happen, it's a good thing to use astrology to figure out why astrologically, and then in terms of real actions in the world, why an event happened when it happened. There are some astrologers that will do enormous amounts of work. They have a belief that every event, that everything that has taken place must have some astrological basis for it, or some astrological parallelism or something like that. And they will go to work sometimes for years to figure it out. And I think that's really great, because that helps all of us, because it moves astrology forward and helps us understand human nature and what we do that produces events. Now, there are several techniques that we have in our current astrology, and we've talked about them before. And if we use these techniques and if we combine them, we have multiple tools for finding events and periods and being able to understand them. But even with the tools that we have compounded together, there are still many things that current astrology cannot predict, forecast, or bring understanding to. Again, the ability, or how much can be predicted or seen through, it varies from astrology to astrology. But some of it is due to the deficiency of astrology. So, in this talk, we're going to discuss some attempts to understand more and predict more and move astrology forward. Now, we're going to discuss mostly the philosophy behind the techniques that have been put forth to expand astrology. But even in that, we're not going to be exhaustive. Even in future weeks, we'll probably do, future months, we'll probably do more of this, but we will never be exhaustive, because you would never believe how much astrologers have tried to do with these things. Now, I don't have a lot of experience with some of these techniques, because in my practice of astrology, I didn't need them. I more helped people to understand their problems as they were, not trying to predict what was the outcome was going to come out of the situations. So I don't have that kind of experience. So a lot of the material that we have tonight will not be from my personal experience in astrology and helping people with their life problems. A lot of it is going to be talking about the theory of things. What makes this work? Does it work? All in a theoretical sense. All right, we're ready to study the first extension to astrology, which are called tertiary progressions. Tertiary means of a third order. That means that there are things of greater importance, such as primaries and secondaries, and tertiaries are third places. Win, place, show. This is show. Now, primary directions are primary. Secondary progressions are secondary. And this is the way astrologers for hundreds of years have been doing it. And this means that tertiary things are tertiary. Now, there are two types of tertiary progressions that have been introduced into astrology. Type 1 is where each day after birth equals one synodic month after birth. Of course, this brings up something that'll come up a couple times this evening, synodic. The word synod, as we say, like the Catholic Church a few years ago had a synod. Syn means the same as it does in synonym or that kind of grammatic usage. And nod is where our word node comes from. It's a place. It's a juncture. So synodic means that something has come to the same place. Now, type 1 tertiary progressions were invented by a German astrologer. I don't know why, but German astrologers have had a lot to do with inventing astrological systems, some of them pretty exotic. I don't know what there is. I guess maybe there's something about the very disciplined nature that has an enantiodromia that leads to wild kinds of speculations. But this astrologer was named E.H. Tronsky, which actually is a Polish name, and it was invented or developed around the time of the Second World War. Type 2 of tertiary progressions, in it, each synodic month after birth equals 1 year in the future. Now, type 2 tertiary progressions are no longer called tertiary progressions. In our modern times, if you look in a book or if you look on a computer that does all these things for you automatically, they're called minor progressions to differentiate them from secondary progressions. So it avoids confusion with type 1. Now, type 2 tertiary progressions were also developed by E.H. Tronsky around the same time, which was during the Second World War. There must have been a lot of pressure on him or something like that, or maybe they were trying to justify Nazism or things like that. I actually have a book talking about the astrology of the Third Reich written by a Nazi astrologer, and he tries to use astrology to predict the ultimate success of the Third Reich and the glory of Germany in the progress of humanity. And he predicts on this date something will happen that is for the glory of Germany and its destiny in the world. And he goes through a number of them, and in each one of them, the Germans were soundly defeated. So you can see that given astrological positions can be interpreted in more than one way. All right. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take a very long theoretical exegesis to determine the theoretical validity of tertiary progressions and of all of the means of forecasting and predicting. All the things that we've looked at before, we're going to look at them again, but we're going to look at them in a more theoretical way so we can get the idea of what is behind them. Now we're going to try to do this in order of validity. The techniques that are most valid will be discussed first until we get to the least valid techniques. Clearly, the most direct and the least symbolic method of forecasting and prediction involves the use of transits. As we remember, transits are the relationships of the stars in the planets, especially in the heavens, in relation to the natal horoscope. But actually, they don't have to be in relation to the natal horoscope. They can be in relation to anything in any moment of time. So a transit is a comparison of one moment of time to another moment of time. And what is born in one moment is affected by the one in the moment that happens afterwards. Sometimes you can even find a determinate relationship where the first moment in time produces what happens in the second moment of time. So, the only thing that separates transits from any other differentiation of moments in time is the distance. Usually when we relate a moment in time, we relate it to the moment that preceded it and the moment that followed it, even if the moment is something as large as a year or a century or something like that. The thing with transits is they can relate to any two moments at any two periods in time. Now, sometimes historians relate what happens in one period of time to what happens in another period of time. They don't usually use astrology for that, but they use that kind of technique. You see that there are a lot of people that have a cyclical view of astrology. In fact, we even have that old statement that is so often made, and that is history repeats itself. And by relating conditions at one time to conditions at another time, insight can be gotten into the past or into the future of those two times. So that this is not something unusual. This is something that's done all the time. So we correlate any two moments in time that can be done by transits. Even if both moments in time have occurred already, or both have not occurred yet. We're talking with a very fluid means of understanding things. All you have to do is know how the planets are moving in the cosmos, and you can use the tool of transits. Now, this is a tool that is really not used to its full potential. It's the most commonly used tool for forecasting and prediction, but it isn't used thoroughly enough, and it isn't used often in the ways that I have suggested here tonight. And I think astrologers listening to this, or students of astrology listening to this, might benefit from this. The next most direct and low symbolic means of forecasting and prediction is primary directions. Primary directions are not based necessarily on the stars as they are at the moment. They're based on the axial rotation of the Earth. The idea of primary directions is that theoretical divisions of the Earth change their perspective relative to the heavens. And as a result of that, conditions are going to change, and what comes out of those conditions is what is thought to be understood by using primary directions. Now, the locations or the theoretical divisions that are used in primary directions are the cusps of houses. And the cusps of houses are the way we look at the heavens from a given point. So they're marking points. Now, the ascendant, which is on the eastern horizon, the cusp that is on the eastern horizon, and the midheaven, which is the cusp that is straight overhead, are the two most important cusps. In fact, in terms of primary directions, the midheaven is the most reliable and the most important anyway. Now, there are simple things that the idea behind primary directions, there are simple things that we can come to understandings of that make sense. For example, the light, the constitution of light as dawn is different than the constitution of light at noon, and different than in evening, and certainly different than in midnight when there is no direct light. There may be a few neutrinos or neutrons coming through the earth and bombarding us, but there isn't any visual light. So, things are relating to a different light depending on the angle. We remember that the most important factor in astrology is angle. Now, there have been experiments where they have taken plants and they have deprived them of light in certain hours of the day. Meaning to say you'd have two plants and you put one plant out and leave it there all day long. The other plant, grown under identical conditions, as identical as you can make it, at a certain hour of the day you cover it up so it doesn't get the sunlight. And then you see the effects of that. And the effects of that, the plant isn't as productive. Sometimes it doesn't even come to fruiting at all. And the effect of this carries into the second, third, and sometimes even the fourth generation being deprived of light. Now, that's an experiment by negative. If you don't get something, you are deprived, but that indicates that light coming in at different angles does have a different effect. All right. Now, the problem, or the most problematic part of primary directions, is finding a metric of futurity. That is, how much rotation of the Earth represents how much time in the future. We're talking about an expansion of time, and we're talking about the ability to abstract time and see consequences of what's going to come out in the future. Now, on the average, the Earth rotates on its axis every 24 hours. And that means it goes through 360 degrees in 1,440 minutes. And that means it goes through 1 degree every 4 minutes of time. The 1 degree of space is a standard metric that has been used by astrologers through the years. The way it is used is that each degree of space represents 1 year of futurity, 1 year ahead. Now, one can say an indirect connection, what I'm trying to get at is why 1 degree represents a year. And that 1 degree is important. We're trying to understand the abstract basis for the practical application of primary directions. And to do that, we want to understand why a day equals a year. Now, one can see an indirect connection because the Earth goes through 1 degree of space in its orbital revolution, 1 degree every year. However, we're not talking about the orbital revolution. We're talking about the axial rotation. Now, however, the rotation does not depend on the orbital revolution. Now, there is a cosmogonical connection between axial rotation and orbital revolution, in that when the solar system was forming and the planets were thrown off or congealed in the solar system, everything was spinning in the same direction. And when you throw off something like a planet, when the whole cosmos is going in a direction, it's going to cause the axial rotation to go in that direction. Now, that's a cosmogonical connection that you can see that it works. And that may be the basis for why 1 degree equals 1 year. Because there is still some kind of abstract connection. Now, but to me, that isn't a direct relationship. That isn't a direct connection. Now, I'm willing to believe that the ancients, this is in primary directions, go back thousands of years, and they have been proven to be efficient for thousands of years. And I'm willing to believe that very good thinkers and very good observers that of the astrologers of old, the ancients, had a reason. It could even be just pure induction, that they discovered it sort of by accident, that each 4 minutes after birth equals a year. I don't know, but I'm willing to believe that there's something there, but I cannot say that I know that there is a cosmological connection, though there is a vague cosmogonical connection. Now, it isn't bad to be living in a world with a tentative belief that the ancients did find something that I don't know, or that modern astrologers don't seem to know. There's nothing wrong with living in a tentative belief. A lot of things that we live with every day are tentative in our life. All right. Now we come to the next most viable, the next most relevant, the next most workable means of forecasting and prediction, and that is secondary progressions. Now, secondary progressions are not based on the axial rotation. They are based exclusively on the orbital revolution of the Earth around the Sun, but there is to some extent the orbital revolution of all of the other planets around the Sun. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Earth moves through 1 degree of space every day. It varies. In wintertime, it goes through more than a degree because we're closer to the sun in wintertime, and in summertime, like it is now, we're 1 degree further away. Now, the thesis of secondary progressions is that the progressions of the components of the horoscope as they move forward express the life of the native that is in the horoscope. Progressions are, when we talked about transits, we said they came from without. When we talked about primary directions, we were talking about the relationship to the environment based on something local. And so they are very good at predicting things in a local sense. But progressions have to do more with what comes from within working outward. Now, very streetwise astrologers from the past have had a sort of like a motto. They say, transits are what the world does to you, and progressions are what you do to the world. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about secondary progressions. Now, abstracted, the fact that the Earth moves forward 1 degree, any given moment in the outward expression can be expressed as widening into the future. Now, when we talked about this first, which must have been a couple of years ago, things happen very slowly in this country, we said it is like a stone being thrown or dropped in the water. Rings come out from the stone, and the moment of impact is described in expansion in each ring. That the first ring out expands the moment so that it isn't just a splash, but what was involved in the splash. You can measure what happened in the splash by measuring what is at the first ring out from the stone being dropped in the water. So that's a pretty good image for it. Now, the metric that is used for secondary progressions, here we go again, is that each day after birth represents 1 year after birth, which is again the common thing in all of these methods is not days but degrees. But with secondary progressions, since we're talking about the Earth in its orbital revolution, 1 day does equal 1 degree. Now, when we're working with any method of forecasting and predicting, we're working with abstractions. However, working with abstraction, even in cosmology, does not mean that there are not any principles that are dealt with in abstraction. So, the abstraction here is that the day is a solar cycle, and the year is a solar cycle. And we go back to the old saw that we've been using again and again, as above, so below. There is an analogical abstract relationship between the day and the year. And so we would expect that this system, secondary progressions, if it works because it's based on the universe seeing an abstract with an analogy of abstraction. All right. Now, it's up to us to determine by both intuition and observation whether this thesis is acceptable. We did experiments. We talked about experiments when we talked about the primary directions. You can also set up experiments that indicate secondary progressions. I didn't take the time to put any of those experiments down. Perhaps I should have. All right, we'll have more to say about this later. Now, when we start talking about directions, it must be noted that in explaining secondary progressions, we might be drawing out, might be giving a picture of how the environment draws us out. Again, in relationship to transits, it is the outer world impinges on us and we respond. But with progressions, since they work from within out, we can see that the outer world in abstract movement draws out the character. And that's what we're trying to get at when we're looking at secondary progressions. So, the metric of secondary progressions, we say, is 1 day stands for 1 year. And on the average, the Earth moves 1 degree per day. Now, in this way, we can see that days and degrees are interchangeable. And from this, we can say that each day relates to 1 year. And this would mean that primary directions do not relate exclusively to axial rotation, but that there is some analogous indirect relationship. All right. Now, this way of thinking about things is not completely foreign to the ways of the ancient people, and they did quite well with it. All right. Now this brings us to abstractly discussing tertiary progressions, which is our subject for tonight. Let's take type 1 first. In type 1, each day after birth represents 1 synodic lunar month in futurity. And a synodic month is the amount of time that it takes for the moon to return to the same relationship with the sun that it had at the beginning of the cycle. The synod of the moon is usually measured in terms of new moons. So the synod or the synodic cycle of the moon is usually measured from new moon until the next moon, and measured very exactly. The synodic month is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and 3 seconds. If you get more precise than that, you find that it's changing because the moon is gradually drifting out to space, but it's very, very gradual, and that the axial rotation of the Earth is actually slowing down, and there is a relationship between those two movements, but we're talking about things that are really, really tiny. Now, a synodic month is different than a sidereal month. A sidereal month is when the moon is in relationship to a star until the moon is again in relationship to that same relationship to that same star. It doesn't make any difference the fact that the Earth and the moon are moving forward as a system together. It's just how long, this is how long it takes the Earth, the moon to make one cycle around the Earth. And that is shorter. And that is I got here 27 days, 7 hours, 43 minutes, and 11.5 seconds. So a synodal month is 2.2 days longer than a sidereal month. Astrologers almost never do anything with a sidereal month. Some use it to understand whether the moon is going fast or slow, but that's not a normal usage of it. However, astronomers use the sidereal month quite a bit, and they do a lot with that because they're doing something different than astrologers. Well, this might take more than 45 minutes. It might even take more than an hour, which would shock me. But I guess I get pretty talkative. Now we're talking about this type 1. The use of a day to represent a synodic lunar month is questionable. It is highly questionable in terms of valid abstract theorization. The sun has a relationship with the day. The moon does not have a relationship with the day. Days and years are both solar, but not lunar. A day means nothing to the moon, so to speak, or to the lunar month. It isn't an equal division of a month, not a synodic nor a sidereal month. So there is really no analogical connection between the day and the month. Now, if there are tertiary events, they're most likely to be accidental coincidences, and they're not due to any regular revolution or rotation. Now, that's making a very strong statement, but theoretically, there is no basis for type 1 synodic progressions. Now let's look at the minor progressions, which are type 2. In this case, each synodic lunar cycle stands for 1 year of futurity. In this case, there are 2 cycles. And it isn't like the moon where there isn't a cycle. There's a lunar cycle, which is 29 days, and then there's an annular solar cycle. Nothing could be more lunar than a lunar synod. That's a true lunar cycle. However, the year is a solar year. And there's no reason to think, other than that they're both cycles, there is no cosmological reason to think why there should be a relationship between a synodical cycle and an annual solar cycle. Now, there is such a thing as a lunar year, which is more a matter of calendration, and it's still used in places like China and Chinese astrology, one of the forms of Chinese astrology. And there is such a thing as a truly lunar calendar. And it is kept very scrupulously, because in Islam, everything is done according to a lunar calendar. This is why the Eid festival varies so very much from year to year. sometimes it's in fall and sometimes it'll be in summer, and it's because you're dealing with two different kinds of calendars that don't relate to each other. Now, I don't even know if there is an astrology that is based on a lunar calendar. I know there is one that's based on a solar lunar calendar, but it's a totally different kind of astrology and not what we're talking about at all. So what I guess I'm trying to say here is that forecasting and prediction from minor progressions is likely to be not reliable. It isn't on completely shakeable, it isn't on completely invalid connections as type 1 are, but there's no reason to believe that they should work at all. All right. Now we have looked theoretically at these two types of progressions, lunar progressions. Now we're ready to, we looked at it in abstract and we've looked at it a little bit in terms of the history of science, and now it's time to see how they actually hold up. Going with the old statement, the proof of the pudding is in the eating of it. Now, in order to do this, we would have to do a statistical study. And there's no way that I am set up to, at this time in life especially, there's no way that I'm set up to do a statistical study. Such studies have been done, and they usually require looking at 10,000 horoscopes, and they usually are done nowadays with a computer. The most famous of such studies involved 50,000 horoscopes. And with that, you can do better with statistics, and you can pick out something if something is valid. So what I did is something very unscientific and very unvalid, but just something to get an idea of whether these methods of forecasting and prediction have anything at all to them. But there's no hope of vindicating or disproving any of these methods or theories. So what I did is I took 3 horoscopes that I know pretty well, and the owners of these 3 horoscopes are all dead. At least they're not on this plane anymore. And what I did is looked at one very highly significant event in all 3 horoscopes. And the most significant event is death. Death, since it is something undeniable, should show up if astrology is true. In fact, there are astrologers that try to determine the time of birth from events in life, and the events that they most want to use are deaths, like deaths of your parents or things like that, and because the deaths are the most sure kind of event for determining, for doing the guesswork that rectification is. Now, what it did is took these horoscopes, and I transited them, I directed them, I progressed them, and looked to see if there were any indicators. But again, I have to repeat that This is a really small selection, and you might get something from it, but there might be a lot of things that are also false positives. So that's what you have to do when you have a small sample. You get a lot of false positives or false negatives. If you're interested, 2 of the horoscopes were for females and 1 was male. One of the natives died of an auto accident. One of the natives died from the effects of advanced cancer, and one of them died from congestive heart failure. Now, I would have displayed the horoscopes and put them up on the screen and then looked at them all, but it would mean there would be 15 horoscopes for each of these 3 people. And that was a bit too much for me. It would have been a mess. So the class wouldn't have worked out well. All right. This is the result and what I have concluded from them. There was only one consistent correlative: transits. And this is just what we predicted from theory, because the transits are direct. In this very tiny sample, each horoscope had one major malefic transit at the time of death. One of them had 3 major malefic transits at death, and that is the one that died of an automobile accident. It's as if the stars were really against that person or sitting on that person that day. Ooh, okay, I think we're all right. And this kind of makes sense, but I don't know how to put it into words. That an event like an accident would have more correlative astrological transits than just a death of old age, which is what congestive heart failure really is. All right. Now, some things we have to address before going forward. Again, I have to say, this is not a valid mathematical study, not by any means. There have been such studies, and they are a very large undertaking. There have been people who have spent years and years, for many hours per day, without a computer, working out many horoscopes and coming to conclusions from them. For us, normal human beings, we're probably better off to just scan horoscopes and intuitively note the significance. The way astrology, or the way a computer works, it works with needle in the haystack searches. It goes through every permutation and possibility that there are at all, and then it finds out if there are statistical correlations that are significant in some of them. Humans can't, with our consciousness as it is now, we cannot do needle in the haystack studies. We might someday when we have a much bigger consciousness and a much better intuition, but right now we can't do that. So what we did here was basically more a satisfaction of curiosity and to get a feel of what's involved when doing this kind of research or trying to understand these different types of techniques. I can't say that this is a major accomplishment, but I did benefit from it in terms of astrological understanding, and I hope you folks do also. It's also a very good vehicle to discuss the things that we talked about earlier in the theoretical part of this talk. So it did help me clarify my thinking quite a bit. All right. Now the fact that only one consistent coincidence was a major malefic transit active in all the horoscopes at the time of death, that's consistent with what we've been saying all night. In fact, there have been scientific studies about transits and their effects. And I'm talking about hard-nosed scientific studies. RCA Communications did a study at one time because they found out that radio communications were better at some times than at other times. And when they narrowed it down, they could say that the relationships between major heavenly bodies coincided with good radio reception and bad radio reception. And they used just the major bodies. I think they used the Sun, Moon, Jupiter, and Venus. And they were able to predict with 92% accuracy. And they found the same things that astrologers found. They found that radio reception was bad with the bad aspects, that is, with the squares and the oppositions, and that radio reception was good with the good aspects of sextiles and trines. That is, to me, a very significant study that has been all but forgotten. I think if you ask the majority of astrologers today whether they know anything about that study, they would say no. There's some value to being an old person. I can lay down the old man thing on you. All right. What we're just saying is that the forces in effect at one moment in time interact with the forces or the force fields interact at another moment in time. We're saying that each moment is a force field and that the newer ones are more dynamic, but there are relationships between them and other force fields. It doesn't have to be a horoscope. We're just saying that it's just what's in the air. Now, from this way of thinking, I don't consider complete the forces of death, nullify the forces at birth. They don't nullify them, they just coincide with when those forces at birth, they're the last gasp interference that comes in the moment in time. All right. The next most natural and less symbolic method is primary directions. In primary directions, there is an abstract expansion or condensation of time, condensing, I should say. That is how the points on the Earth will change in relation by axial rotation. This is something that is concrete. And again, we'll say that the metric that is used is 1 degree of space standing for 1 year, which means 1 day after, every 4 minutes, which is 1 degree, standing for a year. So this is a matter of finding where the primary cusps were at the time of death relative to the constituents of the horoscope at birth. Mostly you want to look at the midheaven and the ascendant. You can use other cusps, but things get really hairy, and then you get into problems with different tables of houses and things like that. It becomes an ugly, ugly, thick mess. It is the proverbial can of worms. when we did that, or when I did this in this little study, only one had a major malefic primary direction to a natal planet. It was the ascendant directed to Saturn. And it was in the male horoscope with the congestive heart failure. And it represented a tiring out. That's what age is, a tiring out of an old heart. And what congestive heart failure wasn't a term that used to be used. It used to be called death by natural consequences. The consequence of natural causes is what they used to say. So we can make this individual correlation and come to that kind of understanding, but it would be very invalid to generalize from this. The horoscopes, 3 horoscopes, are just not a valid sample to do anything at all. So this demonstrates again that the value of astrology lies in the individual. And in the individual horoscope, if you were an heir looking for your inheritance, you might want to look at the transits of Saturn to a high leg or a life and death point in the horoscope. But this is not something that you want to do. All right, now we're almost at an hour already, so it's going to be about an hour and 10 minutes. The next thing we turn to is secondary progressions. And when we do that, we find that one of the 3 horoscopes had no major malefic progressed aspect. Another one of them had several minor aspects of a malefic nature. Some of them were even mixed. And the last one had one major malefic progressed aspect. Now, since progressions work from within outward into the world, in contradistinction to transits that work from the world into the individual, it may be valid to interpret these aspects, progressed aspects at death, as a destiny dump. The last effort of the person to throw off something that they probably have been fighting with their entire life. This is in the struggle with a good or bad attitude. This is that struggle carried to the ultimate, and you finally got it out of you and died in the doing of it. Now that may sound awfully dark, and it may sound, what's the right word here? I'm getting tired. I'm not being able to pick up the words that I want. It might sound morbid, but it isn't, because we have specific things that we want to work out here. And if we don't, we have to come back and work on them again until we do get them worked out. And so that if somebody vomits out a whole bunch of negative aspects at death in the death horoscope coming from within out, that's probably a good sign. It isn't, we're not saying that this caused the death. We're just saying that the person died taking those things out with them. And that, I think, is, in terms of destiny and rebirth, I think that's a very healthy thing. So again, what we see here is looking at things this way. We're not looking at something like a prediction or forecasting, but even in this very sketchy most likely statistically invalid approach that we're taking to things, we can see that there are things that are important in looking at death. And in this case, we say there are things that are important even in the negative aspects present at death. All right. And we finally get where we want to get to, and we get there at 1 hour, and I'm happy that I had enough for 1 hour anyway. Now we come to the tertiary progressions. And in this, I was surprised. In one horoscope, we're looking at number 1 tertiaries first. In one horoscope, there were none. In the other 2, there were more than one, including a lot of maybes. And when you look at this, you think, wow, maybe there is something to tertiaries. That's the way I felt the first time I worked with them. But then when I worked with them more, and when I began to think about them, that was, fool's gold. It didn't turn out to be something that had any reality to it. One has to understand a little bit about probabilities. Suppose someone says that everyone in their garden club, 4 out of 7 members of the garden club, have such and such positioning in their horoscope. And since that's more than half, one is tempted to say that, wow, there must be a correlation between that kind of positioning and gardening. But that doesn't work. First of all, you have to look at that in terms of probabilities and in all permutations. That is to say, how many of all people have that positioning in their horoscope. And if it turns out that it is about the same as the members of the garden club, that it is meaningful, and you can't make a correlation with that. Now, this is something that is missing from astrology. I have looked everywhere in astrology, and I've seen individual instances where something is picked out of a horoscope, and they say the odds of this happening are so and so to so and so, and what they're doing is pointing out a very remarkable event, a rare event. And I have never seen tables of the probabilities of all of the different standard things that we see in horoscopes. For years, I have wanted to set up a program, write a program, and run it on a computer and run those out and publish it as an almanac to astrologers so that they could not be deceived by things that seem to be meaningful. But unfortunately, one of my weaknesses in life is that I am greedy, and I kept having more and more things that I wanted to include in that book of tables or an atlas or whatever you want to, almanac wouldn't be right. And more things, and the program became bigger and bigger, and the amount of run time to pull it off became bigger and bigger. And I was always too busy in life, and I never got to carry it out. It's in the air now. I've mentioned it. I've thought it for a long time, and I've mentioned it several times, but now I have mentioned it full out publicly, so maybe somebody will pick it up and do that. It would really be a good service, because it's a simple thing. If you see this see this combination in a horoscope, and you want to see how often does that happen. You could just go to the book and look it up and say, wow, that is significant. So what I'm trying to say, there are going to be times, if you just take time altogether, there are going to be times when there are positions that indicate that tertiary progressions type 1 do work. It will appear like that. But that's altogether different than having something consistent. And what I'm saying is this, the fact that two of the three horoscopes we looked at had more than one tertiary aspect at the moment of death. That's meaningless to me, because there are a lot of other moments that would have, a lot of other times that would have similar things that also didn't have any meaning. So what I'm trying to say is that in terms of the philosophy of science, with this small of a sample, you cannot, in terms of something as vague as tertiary progressions, you cannot say that there's any validity. I couldn't even get anything intuitively. I wanted to look at it positively, and the first time I ever tried working with tertiary predictions, they did seem to work, and I tried to see how it worked out, but it didn't. It didn't at all. How to say it? Now, there are people who have not analyzed from the philosophy of science the validity of tertiary progressions. And there are, and some of these are famous astrologers for whom I have no respect, and when I found this out, I have even less respect. But when they look at a time, like the time of death or at the time of meeting some new person or something like that, they look at the progressions and the transits and the directions and things like that. And then to get the final picking up what the background was like, they use tertiary progressions. And they literally do that thinking that they are filling in the background. Now, their intuition might be picking something up from reality, but it isn't coming through tertiary progressions. And these people are fooling themselves, and to me, I think it is irresponsible, and it is almost, if people are believing what you're saying, it's almost a cruel act to use tertiary progressions in that way. It's just not an ethical thing at all. All right. Finally, we come to minor progressions, which are type 2 tertiaries. When we look at them, one horoscope had none, one had a maybe, and one had a major malefic aspect. However, again, we have no statistical basis to believe this. This might just be an accidental happening, and that we can't describe the death of this person on the basis of that. I'm tired out, and I'm at this point, I've had enough of talking about astrology that has no theoretical basis and whose practical application is based on illusion and not upon an understanding of permutations and probabilities. So, my take is, regarding tertiary progressions, you can explore them if you want. You might come to a much different conclusion than I do. It's great to be open-minded and to try things even if other people have thought, even highly regarded people, even if they thought they were no good, it's still worth trying because you'll learn something. But in terms of the things that you can study in astrology to improve your understanding of human character and how to forecast and predict, I would not recommend putting a lot of effort into tertiary progressions, and I wouldn't waste a lot of time on it. But explore at your own at your own discretion. Now that's all we have for this evening. Next time we will go forward and we'll look at some more things that are meant to expand or extend astrology. One thing I know for sure we're going to talk about next time is arcs, solar arcs and ascension arcs, and so that'll be next time. Thank you very much for listening to this. It was longer than I thought it would be. I hope it is helpful to you.